Yesterday we went to the Long Beach Flea Market. It's been a little while since I last went, but it is my favorite local flea market, and it was the first one of the year, so a lot of people came out for it. There was a great feeling in the air, this kind of sense of community. I love it when flea markets have that nice social aspect, as opposed to going to department stores now, which are really different. They're kind of like ghost towns and a little bit depressing to go shopping in. I have a lot to say about that, but I'll talk about that in another video. But it was great to people watch, and I saw a lot of amazing things, including vintage stereo equipment. Now this is a problem for me. If I see a vintage Marantz receiver or amplifier, I just want it. They look so great, so sexy, and they sound amazing. But I've been burned by this before. Twice. I buy a vintage stereo receiver, I hook it up, which takes a little while, it's very fiddly, and it sounds fantastic for a few weeks, then things go wrong. It starts sounding poppy and scratchy and fuzzy, and the connections are just bad. And if I knew how to fix these things, that would be amazing, but I don't. And I don't know anyone in Los Angeles who can help me with that. So I learned my lesson. If I see a sexy vintage stereo receiver, I walk away, as much as I do want to take them home. I find that in general, flea markets are usually really good for finding glass objects. And so Brennan and I came across these mercury glass orbs at one stand and got really excited. We knew exactly what they were because maybe about 2 years ago, we visited Mexico City and we went to 2 houses designed by Luis Barragan. Gorgeous architecture. And we found that he liked to decorate with these mercury glass orbs. He'd put them in the corner of a room on a stand and they just reflect light nicely. A really distinctive, beautiful, unique decorative object. So we saw them. They're not designed by Luis Barragan, he just liked them. Turns out we liked them too. So we asked the seller how much they were, and he said, "If you can tell me what these are, I'll give you a great price for them." We made the mistake of telling him too much. We said, "Oh, these are mercury glass orbs. The famous architect Luis Barragan loved them and used them everywhere in his houses. And if you go to Mexico City, you can see them, blah, blah, blah." He could see that we were excited and we put so much value into these objects. So he said, "Okay, well, I want to sell them as a set for $350, which is way too much." And we didn't want the whole set. Brennan saw one in particular that had a fantastic shape, and that's the one he wanted. And he asked, "Can I just buy that one?" And he said, "I did want to keep them as a set, but if you break my arm, I might sell you just the one for $300. $300. He may as well have said, "For you, $400. It was crazy because he could see that they were valuable to us and they'd be junk for someone else. And he put this ridiculous price on them. So we walked away, but couldn't stop thinking about them. Then I came across this beautiful glass vase that looks Scandinavian to me. It looks very 60s. It's so heavy and had all these beautiful bubbles in it. There were no markings on the bottom, so I didn't have any more information, but I just thought it looked great. And it was a reasonable price, but I don't tend to buy things right away. I like to do more laps around the flea market and mull it over a little bit, so that's what I did. After a few more laps, Brennan was making himself crazy. He wanted that mercury glass orb, so we went back, and this time there was a woman standing at the stall. And we said, "We'd like to buy just this one orb," and we named the price, which is a lot more fair, to be honest. And she said, "Let me check. I know that he wanted to keep these together as a set." Then she comes back and said, "No, the price is $350 for all 4. And we said, "Okay." And we started walking away, and then she goes, "Okay, you can have it." So we got the one orb for a fair price, And we gave her even more information. She looked up Louis Barragan on her phone, and now she's got a good spiel for the next people. I'm sure she'll sell the other 3, no problem. Flea markets tend to be really good for finding old perfume bottles as well. There was one guy who had all of these classic masculines, but the ones that I checked out seemed to be empty, so I think he was just selling them for the bottle itself. There were 3 bottles of Kouros, and I love vintage Kouros. It's one of the fragrances that got me interested in scent in the first place. This is way back in 1985 maybe. But I just assumed they were empty. I was kind of hoping they were, because if there was any juice in there, then I'd want them. That means haggling, and sometimes you just get exhausted at flea markets. I saw this bottle of opium, but it was only about 1/3 full. I do want opium in my collection. This is such an incredible fragrance to me. But I think I want more than 1/3 full. I know I'm being kind of precious about it. Also, when I smelled it from the cap, it smelled a little bit off, which isn't really such a big deal. I found that when fragrances go off, it usually only affects the top notes, which is the first 10 minutes of the fragrance's wear. And then after 10 minutes, it goes into the heart and the dry down, and it just smells the way it's supposed to. Even still, I walked away from opium. But on this one table, I saw these 3 bottles of Chamade from Guerlain, and they're in the vintage bottles, the big ones. This made me excited, especially because in the last week I watched 2 movies that featured Guerlain bottles. One was Belle du Jour from the 1960s, and Catherine Deneuve's character sitting at her dressing table, and I just happened to spy a big bottle of Mitsuko there, and it's in the vintage bottle. Great detail. And then the other night, I watched Maria, where Angelina Jolie plays the opera diva Maria Callas. And I saw that on her dressing table, she had a big bottle of Shalimar. So when I saw these bottles of Chamade, it was very much in what was exciting me at the time. But I walked away, because do I need 3 bottles of Chamade that have all been used? No, but they would be great decoration. So we left the flea market, very happy with our purchases. And as soon as I got home, I filled that bubbly Scandinavian vase with water and put 1 single iris stem in there. It's really stunning. If you fill the vase all the way to the top with water, it looks like the stem is coming out of a block of glass, of bubbly glass. It's really beautiful. And there's something about this kind of iris that to me is so 80s. It's 80s glam. And that's nice to have in the house. And then I fished out my bottle of Mitsuko. Way back in the early 2000s when I was living in London, Mitsuko was having this renaissance. A lot of my friends were wearing it. It's a very old scent. It came out in 1919, but for some reason in the early 2000s, a lot of people were wearing Mitsuko again. And that's when I fell in love with it. It was such a distinctive, beautiful, sophisticated scent. It's the consummate sheep. And if you're not familiar with sheep, it's a scent accord that's made up of bergamot, cistus labdanum, and oak moss and or patchouli in the base. When these things are combined, it creates a very distinctive smell, and it's the core of a lot of famous perfumes from the mid-century up through the 80s. That's kind of the heyday of chypres, even though they first came out much earlier in the 20th century. But because they're associated with this time period, now chypres smell very vintage and from another world. But that's a world I love. I didn't buy Mitsuko back when my friends were wearing it, but I kept thinking about it. And eventually, after I moved to LA, I did buy a bottle when I was back in Paris visiting. I got it at the flagship Guerlain boutique on the Champs-Élysées. And they had these blue tassels in a bowl. You could just take one for free. So of course I had to have one, and I put it in the bottle. But then after all these years, it looks horrible. It aged so badly, but it's part of my Mitsuko story, so I keep it. I have to confess something. When I put Mitsuko on, it doesn't smell so great on me. But I'm not gonna blame me. I'm gonna blame the environment. When I fell in love with Mitsuko, it was in London, and London has a much damper, colder climate than desert like Los Angeles. And I think something about the lack of humidity and the heat just makes this fragrance different. When I smell it on my skin, it's very opaque and kind of flabby. It doesn't really have any facets and it doesn't excite me, I have to say. Also, it smells very formal and dressed up. Like I said, it's incredibly sophisticated. But Los Angeles is a very casual city. It's not like you would put on a finely tailored suit and go to Trader Joe's. In the same way, there are very few instances where I can wear Mitsuko and have it make sense. Perfume people always talk about the peach note in Mitsuko, and I know it's there, it's famous for that, but I work in a store and sell gourmands and fruity fragrances every day, and if you want peach, I'll show you peach, like true facsimiles of the peach smell. This is not that. It's very subtle. And it's so integrated with all of the many other notes that I can barely detect the peach on its own. Just because Mitsuko doesn't smell its best on my skin at the moment doesn't in any way diminish the excellence of this perfume. It's still one of my favorites. I think that there's an optimal time and place for a specific perfume. Sometimes I'll just take the bottle out and smell it because I want to revisit that story. In the same way, I'll dig up an old record and put a specific song on because it brings me to a place I want to be. Mitsuko is known for its orris note. Orris is the root of Iris pallida, and it'll give a perfume a very luxurious, powdery quality. That's definitely true in Mitsuko. In fact, orris is in many of the classical Guerlain perfumes and is even considered part of the classic Guerlain signature. Now, if we look at the back of the box, we can see that there is ionone in Mitsuko. Ionone is the smell of violet. In eugenol, which is the smell of clove. For me, I love that baby powder smell and that floor polish note. It's very specific to Mitsuko, and that's what I crave. And that's what I don't get so much of in Los Angeles. Whereas in London, and probably many other places, it's very distinctive. But yes, this is a masterpiece. And if I were to come up with my 3 Hall of Fame fragrances, Mitsuko would certainly be there. It's art. Now, if you buy the bottle now, unfortunately, it does look a little different. They made a different label and it's simplified. You don't have that wonderful filigree around the circle. And I'm not one of those people who oppose all changes, like as soon as you change one little thing, you're like, it's not as good. But design-wise, it's not as good. So I'm glad I got this bottle when it still looked like this. And guess what? I had a perfect reason to wear this last night because we went out to dinner, which is something we rarely do, but we wanted to be out and celebrate the city and be with fellow Angelinos. So I sprayed a little bit on and we went to dinner at Musso and Frank's, and it was perfection.